Jeff pulled his rig into the brightly lit parking lot of a truck stop just off the Arizona interstate. The truck's air conditioner wasn't working and needed to be worked on. A few hours later, he'd found out from the diesel mechanic that it would take about 2 days to get the truck to blow cold air again. His body felt tired from the long haul, 4 weeks on the road. Usually, he'd stretch out in his sleeper cab, but since he wouldn't be able to drive the truck for 2 days, he decided to rest in a hotel room instead. He requested a rideshare driver on his phone app, destination placed for the nearest hotel. He arrived at the Quinn Hotel less than an hour later. Inside the lobby, the overnight clerk handed him a key card without much conversation. He glanced at the card. Room 214, second floor. He trudged down the hallway, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of his boots. The room smelled faintly of lavender air freshener, an aroma that signaled a temporary escape from the highway. He shut the door behind, exhaling as he set his duffel on the chair. Peeling off his flannel shirt, he rubbed the tension from his neck and collapsed onto the mattress. The silence of the room filled the air. No engine noise, no rumble of tires on pavement. He turned over and stared around the room. As exhaustion pulled him under, he realized something. After a month on the road, Tiffany's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., a sound she was still getting used to. She groaned, rubbing the sleep from her eyes before stretching her arms above her head. The apartment was quiet, the city outside barely stirring. She had been working as a flight attendant for just a few weeks, and though the early mornings were brutal, there was a thrill in knowing that by the end of the day, she'd be miles away from where she started. Slipping out of bed, she moved through her routine with practiced efficiency. A light breakfast, Greek yogurt with honey and a handful of almonds, fueled her for the day ahead. Then came her quick morning workout. A set of squats, some cardio, and weightlifting, just enough to shake off the drowsiness and get her blood pumping. By the time Tiffany stepped into the shower, steam curled around her like a warm embrace. She let the water wash away any lingering exhaustion, her mind already shifting to the hours ahead. Dressed in her crisp uniform, she packed a few essentials into her tote bag: lip balm, an energy bar, a spare pair of stockings. Then, with one last glance in the mirror, she headed out. 2 hours later, as the plane roared down the runway and lifted into the air, Tiffany stole a glance out the window. Below, the city stretched out in golden hues, skyscrapers catching the early sunlight. Beside her, another flight attendant, Marissa, nudged her playfully. "Hey girl, I see you enjoying the skies," she said with a grin. That night, Tiffany and Marissa entered the Quinn Hotel for check-in. "Lobby at noon tomorrow," Marissa confirmed as she slung her overnight bag over her shoulder. "Sounds good," Tiffany replied, stifling a yawn. They parted ways, each disappearing down separate hallways. Tiffany swiped her keycard and stepped into her room, the cool air conditioning a welcome relief from the warmth of the terminal. She dropped her bag onto the chair, kicked off her shoes, and headed straight for the shower. The following morning, Tiffany stirred her coffee absent-mindedly as the morning news droned on in the background. She had only taken a few bites of her toast when the door to the breakfast lounge opened, drawing her attention. The man who walked in carried himself with a relaxed kind of confidence. Tall, well-built, with smooth, dark skin and short, curly hair, he had an air of quiet self-assurance. Tiffany glanced up just as he met her gaze, and he offered a polite nod before heading to the buffet. They began to have a conversation about the news report of an airplane crash that had recently taken place. Tiffany stared ahead, sipping her coffee. "Tell me about it. The travel industry is a mess right now." Jeff moved over with his breakfast plate and coffee to hers and continued, "Hope you don't mind. I can hear you better over here." Tiffany gazed at him and smiled. Jeff said, "You sound like you're experienced in the travel industry." "You might say that. I'm a flight attendant, just got out of training last month," Tiffany replied. He let out an impressed whistle. "Oh, so you're fresh in the skies." Tiffany exhaled, considering her answer. "Yes, it has. It's ups and downs, but I enjoy it." Jeff nodded knowingly. "Yeah, I get that. I'm a long-haul truck driver, gone for days at a time, sleeping in random places, living out of a suitcase." He smirked. "Well, a duffel bag in my case." Tiffany's eyes lit up. "Really? That actually sounds kind of similar to my job, except I'm in the air and you're on the ground." He chuckled. "No kidding. I'm Jeff, by the way." Tiffany. They talked as they ate, their conversation drifting from the news to travel, to their favorite cities. They found themselves enjoying each other's company. As Jeff finished the last bite of his toast, he glanced at the time on his phone and sighed. I should get going. But hey, he hesitated for just a second, then smiled. If you don't have a boyfriend, could I call you sometime? Tiffany felt warmth rise to her cheeks. At 27 years of age and single, she felt intrigued. She hadn't expected this during the conversation, but she liked it, and she liked him. She held his gaze for a moment, then reached into her bag, pulling out a small notepad and pen. She scribbled down her number and slid it across the table. Jeff gratefully took it with a grin. I'll call you. And with that, he stood, gave her a final glance, and walked out of the breakfast lounge. Tiffany exhaled, staring at her half-finished plate with a small, amused smile. The weeks had passed, and Tiffany had settled into her routine as an airline flight attendant, moving from one city to the next. Her life a blur of check-ins, takeoffs, and hotel stays. Then, one day, out of the blue, her phone rang. Hey, Tiffany, it's Jeff. Tiffany remembered the tall, handsome truck driver she had met during a layover. His voice was just as she remembered, smooth, friendly, and warm. I'm in town, making a drop-off. Thought maybe we could grab dinner, if you're free. Surprised but pleased, Tiffany quickly agreed. When she arrived at the restaurant that evening, she found Jeff already waiting. His broad shoulders relaxed, but his eyes carrying a weight she hadn't noticed before. Over dinner, he explained his delayed call. I wanted to reach out sooner, but honestly, I've had a lot on my plate. My daughter, Jada, she's been struggling in school. She's 12 now, and my ex-wife is having a hard time with her. She's always been a good kid, but lately, she's different, distant, acting out. Tiffany nodded, sympathy softening her features. I get it, she said. I was a handful at that age too. Preteen years aren't easy. Jeff exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Yeah, I just want to be there for her, even with the distance. As the night went on, conversation flowed effortlessly between them. By the time they left the restaurant, stepping out into the cool night air, Tiffany felt a warmth inside her that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. Standing beside her car, Jeff hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. I'm really glad we did this, he murmured. Me too, she replied, looking up at him. Without another word, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with unspoken promise. As they pulled apart, Tiffany smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, attraction. Tiffany and Jeff's relationship blossomed in the months that followed. Whenever he was in town, they spent their time together. Dinners at cozy restaurants, late-night talks in her apartment, weekend outings when his schedule allowed. Despite the distance, their bond deepened, and before long, they both realized what they had was something real. Then one day, Tiffany felt different. Office. At first, she brushed it aside, blaming it on exhaustion from long flights and time zone changes. But when the nausea wouldn't fade and she found herself staring at a positive pregnancy test, reality hit her like turbulence mid-flight. Her hands trembled as she dialed Jeff's number. When he answered, she wasted no time. Jeff, I'm pregnant. There was silence on the other end, long enough to make her heart pound. Then came his voice, steady and sure. I'm on my way. That night, he held her close, reassuring her that they would face this together. I love you, Tiffany. We can do this. I want us to be a family. A month later, they stood in front of a judge, exchanging vows in a small courthouse ceremony. Jeff moved into her apartment, and without hesitation, he took over, paying the rent. As Tiffany's pregnancy progressed, the physical demands of her job became overwhelming, and she made the difficult decision to stop working. I just need to rest, she admitted one evening, rubbing her swollen belly as she sat on the couch. Jeff kissed her forehead. You focus on the baby. I've got us covered. Their son, Jaden, arrived on a crisp autumn morning, and the moment Tiffany held him in her arms, she knew her life had changed forever. The love she felt was unlike anything she had ever known. After a few months, she returned to work, slipping back into her flight attendant routine. But something was different now. Every time she left for a trip, her heart ached. Every layover felt longer, every hotel bed emptier. She found herself counting the hours until she could return home, only to feel crushed when she had to leave again. One evening, as she rocked Jaden to sleep, his tiny fingers curled around hers, and tears stung her eyes. She looked up at Jeff, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore, she admitted. I miss him too much. I want to be home. Jeff studied her, his expression unreadable at first. Then he nodded, then quit. We'll figure it out. Relief washed over her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Her place was here, with her son and the man she loved. Money was tight. Jeff worked long hours, doing everything he could to keep up with their bills, but it wasn't enough. Tiffany loved being home with Jaden, watching him grow, sharing every laugh and new milestone. But every time she saw Jeff come home exhausted, every time she calculated their budget and found it stretched too thin, a deep restlessness grew inside her. One evening, after putting Jaden to sleep, she sat beside Jeff on the couch, her voice soft but firm. "I need to find a job." Jeff sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "Tiff, I get it, but I don't want you stressing yourself out." She reached for his hand. "I know you're doing everything you can, but I want to help. Sylvia said she'd watch Jaden for an affordable fee while I look. Just let me try." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, just be careful, okay?" The next morning, she kissed Jaden goodbye and left to search for work. The reality hit her fast. Store after store, office after office. Everywhere she went, the answer was the same. "We're not hiring. We need someone with experience. Come back another time." The rejection weighed on her, but she pushed on. Finally, she found a restaurant with a help wanted sign, a waitress position. "I can do this," she thought, walking inside with renewed hope. But after a brief conversation with the manager, that hope shattered. "Sorry, we just filled that spot," the man said, barely looking up from his paperwork. Tiffany nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you for your time," she whispered, before stepping outside. She stood by the entrance, staring at the pavement as frustration welled up inside her. The weight of every no she had heard that day pressed down, and before she could stop it, tears threatened to spill. "You all right, miss?" Tiffany wiped her eyes quickly and looked up. A man stood nearby, mid-40s, dressed in a sleek black suit, with a watch that probably cost more than her rent. "I couldn't help but overhear you asking for a job in there," he said. Embarrassed, she straightened. "Yeah, I'm just looking for work." A small smile played at the man's lips. "Well, if you're interested, I could hire you." Tiffany blinked. "Really?" He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. "I own a business. Come by this evening, and I'll explain everything. It's good money, easy work. You won't regret it." She glanced at the card. Harry Fields. No company name. Just an address. That evening, as Jeff settled in with Jaden, Tiffany hesitated before heading to the door. "I got offered a job today," she told Jeff, keeping her voice even. "I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to check it out." Jeff looked up from playing with Jaden. "You sure about this?" She forced a smile. "Yeah, I'll be back soon." The address led her to a dimly lit building in the outskirts of the city. The interior was a dark bar and lounge area. Music thumped through the atmosphere, and a faint scent of alcohol and perfume filled the air. A few men sat scattered about, at different tables, quietly, as if waiting for something. Tiffany went to the bartender and asked for Harry, and moments later, he appeared, grinning like a man who had already sealed a deal. "Glad you came," he said, leading her down a hallway to a quieter room. After they had sat in the small room, Harry said, "Let's talk money. You work hard, you'll start out making $500 a night. It's easy to make even more if you're willing to go the extra mile." Tiffany's breath caught. That was even more than she had made as a flight attendant. "Doing what?" she asked. Harry leaned back against his desk, studying her reaction. "Dancing." He let the words settle before adding, "It's a nightclub, sweetheart. You'd be a stripper." Tiffany felt like the air had been knocked out of her. She stared at him, trying to process. A stripper? The thought stunned her. But then another thought followed. 500 plus a night. She thought about Jaden, about Jeff working himself to exhaustion, about all the times she had looked at their bills and worried. Could she do this? Harry chuckled, reading the conflict in her eyes. "Look, I get it. It's not for everyone. But if you want to make real money, this is your chance." Tiffany swallowed hard. She wasn't naive. She knew what this job entailed. But for that kind of money, could she turn it down? Finally, she met his gaze. "I'll do it." But as she walked out of the club that night, one thought pressed heavily on her mind. Jeff can never know. His face was a storm of emotions. Tiffany felt shocked. She swallowed hard and took a cautious step toward him. "Jeff? How long?" His voice was low and steady. Tiffany hesitated. Lying was pointless. "About 2 years." Jeff exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. 2 years, Tiffany? And you never told me?" She looked away, guilt tightening in her chest. "I didn't know how," she admitted. "I didn't think you'd understand. And we needed the money." Jeff let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "So instead of talking to me, instead of telling me, you decided to go behind my back and He stopped, his jaw tightening as he looked up at the glowing club sign above the entrance. This is where you've been going? This is why you leave our son at Sylvia's each night? Tiffany flinched. It's not like that, she said quickly. Jeff, I only dance. I don't do anything else. It's just a job. Jeff's eyes darkened. Just a job? His voice cracked. Do you have any idea what it's like to find out your wife has been taking off her clothes for strangers while I've been busting my ass on the road, thinking you are working a regular job? Tiffany felt tears sting her eyes. I did it for us, Jeff. For you and Jaden. I was tired of watching you work yourself so much while we barely scraped by. I wanted to help. Jeff stared at her, his expression unreadable now. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, he let out a slow breath, looking away. I don't even know what to say to you right now. Tiffany's heart pounded. Please, Jeff. She reached for him, but he stepped back. Not tonight, Tiff. His voice was distant now, drained. I need time to think. And with that, he turned, got into his van, and drove away, leaving Tiffany standing alone outside the club, her perfect secret world crashing down around her. For days, Jeff barely said a word to Tiffany. His silence was colder than any argument they had ever had. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions, disappointment, anger, hurt. Tiffany could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on her, suffocating her more than any harsh words ever could. She didn't dare step foot in the nightclub now. How could she? Knowing how much it hurt him, how much it hurt the man she loved. She stayed home with Jaden, going through the motions of daily life, but inside, she was unraveling. Every time she reached for Jeff, he pulled away. Every time she tried to speak, he looked through her like she wasn't even there. 4 days later, as she stood at the kitchen sink, staring blankly at the dishwater, Jeff finally spoke. His voice was steady but firm. I need to know where we stand, Tiffany. She turned, searching his face, but his expression was unreadable. If you want this marriage, if you want us, then you need to quit the club. I won't compromise on this. He took a breath, his jaw tightening. And if you don't, I won't just divorce you. I'll seek custody of Jaden too. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt the sting of tears before they even fell. Jeff, please. Her voice broke. I mean it, he said, his gaze unwavering. I need a wife, not a woman dancing half-naked for strangers. If you want to be with me, you have to choose our marriage over the club. Choose our family. Tears streamed down Tiffany's face. The thought of losing Jeff, losing Jaden, shattered something deep inside her. She had never meant for things to spiral like this. After a few moments, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I haven't gone back, as you can see, and I won't go back, if that's the way it has to be. Tiffany walked to him and tightly embraced him. Relief flickered in Jeff's eyes, but he didn't embrace her back. Not yet. The trust had to be rebuilt. Over the next year, things slowly changed. Jeff landed a better-paying truck, driving job, allowing them to move into a small but cozy home in a safe neighborhood. Tiffany stayed home with Jaden, dedicating herself to raising Jaden and to the marriage. It wasn't always easy. Trust took time, but the love between them won in the end. And to Tiffany and Jeff, that was what mattered most.